The latest data shows in July, China's imports rose 27.3% on a year-on-year basis in dollar terms. Meanwhile, China's exports rose 12.2%. Both numbers surpassed expectations. But does this imply that Beijing has effectively weathered the opening volley of US tariffs? 1 month into the trade battle, and neither China nor the US seems ready to relent. The US has explored the option to hit $200 billion worth of Chinese imports with a 25% tariff, increasing from its original 10%. In retaliation, China said on August 3rd it would impose tariffs ranging from 5% to 25% on $60 billion worth of American products. What new impact will they have on the two economies as the burgeoning trade battle escalates? Reports have surfaced about foreign businesses closing their operations in China. How will this influence China's economy? And as China continues opening up key sectors such as financial services to foreign investment, what does the future hold for foreign investment in China? As both countries show no sign of surrender, will this grow into a prolonged trade war that implicates even more countries and industries? Can a series of stop-and-go negotiations yield fruitful results anytime soon?
According to the latest statistics released by the General Administration of Customs, China's trade surplus was sharply narrowed by more than 40% in July, although both gross import and export value surpassed expectations. So, was the decline of the trade surplus due to tariffs enacted since the 6th of July? With more tariffs being implemented, how much further will China's trade be impacted? And how does a looming trade war affect the foreign investment in China? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio today by Mr. He Weiwen, a senior fellow with the Center for China and Globalization, and Mr. Chen Jiahe, chief strategist of Xindia Securities. We shall also speak to Mr. Richard Wolff, a Marxian economist and economics professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst via Skype. So that's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Gentlemen, how do you look at the latest statistics? I mean, the massive shrinking of China's trade surplus.
That is true in renminbi term, but in dollar term, it's another picture. The July, single month of July, we still had a trade in goods surplus of $28 billion, about the same similar monthly average of the previous 6 months of this year. So the export grew still at over 12% over a year ago. So we say that we should follow this trend. Still, so far, the trend is okay.
But Jiahe, why did the Ministry of Commerce deliver this report about the sharp decline in our trade surplus? Was it a political maneuver, or is the factual account about what has really happened?
I think that's another reason, is that the trade surplus did drop when you compare with the data before, and that's mostly because, not because our trade is shrinking, because we have a very huge rise in the import if you look at the data. So that's because China is delivering some of its promises to import more goods from the international market. So that might be another reason. Another thing is that, well, Ministry of Commerce is always giving you data and gives you some explanation, so people read different meanings out of it anyway.
And what do you think of the impact of the depreciation of RMB? Is it policy depreciation?
No. I think Mr. Chen is in a better position to elaborate. I'll say some points on my own. That is, the reason that depreciation of renminbi is vis-à-vis the dollar, not vis-à-vis the basket of currencies. With the measurement of renminbi's exchange rate level should be, first, the basket of currencies index, second, the SDR index of IMF, third, the BIS, the Bank of International Settlement, real effective exchange rate. So the three measurements show that renminbi has been more or less stable. The reason of renminbi's depreciation is because of the appreciation of the dollar.
The newly appointed governor of the Central Bank of China, Mr. Yi Gang, said about a year or so ago, when he was the vice governor, to my knowledge, that there's no such foundation for the depreciation of RMB. What do you make of this analysis?
Well, the fluctuation of foreign exchange rate in the history is the hardest thing to predict. So never try that. It's much harder than stock. It's much harder than property. It's the most complicated thing in the world. But if you look in the long term, I agree his opinion that there is no foundation for the depreciation of RMB. Because if you check out the price that you spend in Beijing and New York, you spend in Shanghai compared with London, it's much cheaper to get the same kind of service in Shanghai and Beijing compared with London and New York. That means your currency will appreciate in the long term. I mean, if you take a taxi, for example, it costs you about 2 or 3 times more money in London or New York for the same distance. So that's the foundation there.
Then what should be the major policy options on the Chinese side that could be used as a hedge against the negative impact of the trade war that was imposed by President Trump?
Oh, yes. I think we should have different tools in pocket and use one of the tools when necessary or another one when necessary. I think that one of the things is we should find an alternative export market. If we export to the U.S. Previously, and now we're faced with a 25% tariff, now we should find an alternate market, or we should try to sell it domestically. That means to encourage domestic consumption and expand the domestic market. Also, we should calculate meticulously, step item by item. For those which are not easily to be replaced in the U.S. market, because many of the Chinese products in the U.S. are not to be replaced very soon. At least 50% of the total items covered are those that the United States depend heavily on imports from China. So in that case, we still have in a position to bargain the price. And also, as a matter of fact, the recent depreciation of the U.S. renminbi vis-a-vis the dollar also helps. So we should have some different ways.
Before we go further down the road, elaborating most likely response from the Chinese side, what do you make of the 3 preconditions for averting a major trade war between the United States and China? Well, these 3 preconditions were actually raised by the U.S. government, namely the Trump administration.
Well, I don't think one government should 100% listen to another government because they claim something. I mean, United States is claiming all these things like free trade, your government shouldn't be guiding the policy, stuff like that, basing on what we know as modern economic theory. But if you have studied modern economic theory, you find a lot of flaws in it. I mean, if you read books of George Soros, he keep on criticizing the economic theory, economics, what we call as fake science. He keep on saying that. So whether if 100% free trade and no government intervention at all, is it really good for a country's development? That is still a question. So, well, if China listens to the United States 100%, I mean, United States is, of course, claiming these things for the benefit of United States. It's not doing good for China. So China has to get its own policy, I would say.
Well, obviously, the 3 preconditions are intended to bring China to its knees.
Yes.
To urge China to surrender unconditionally. What do you think of the alleged ridiculous demands from
yes,
their side?
that's very ridiculous. First, let me just reverse the order. The condition 3, that is China should not retaliate on the U.S. when the United States imposes the tariffs on Chinese goods. That's absolutely not possible because, first of all, the unilateral,
absolutely nonsense.
Impossible nonsense. Because first, the unilateral tariff by the U.S. side is totally in violation of WTO rules. If we say, okay, we just follow that, then they say we obey. We are not defending the WTO system. That's totally wrong. We should never do that. And it also that if you impose tariffs on us, we should certainly counterattack. That's our right, to defend our right. So this condition 3 is out of question. It's totally nonsense. The condition 1, China should change trade practice and trade policies. Then we say, what trade policy, what system should we change? we can only discuss the trade regime and trade policies on the basis of WTO rules. If we have anything or any practice, any concrete measures in violation of WTO rules, we can talk, we can change that, as we have been doing that for years. And number two, precondition two, the industrial policies. Again, this is China's right to develop. Made in China 2025 is China's right. And as to the concrete measures, incentives, if there are any, in violation of WTO rules, we can talk, we can change. But as an industrial policy and the strategy of Made in China 2025, there's no way to talk.
Well, let's look at what the Trump administration wants. There is a Chinese saying, 志在必得. It seems the Americans stand ready to win and win the war absolutely on their terms. What do you think of this prospects?
Well, it sounds like Donald Trump is saying that we're going to win the trade war without any cost to the American people, as he has been claiming that farmers would be suffering, but that's okay, it's good for Americans tomorrow. But that's not right, because if you really study Donald Trump's business strategy in the past, he's famous for what he's called claiming a very high target and targeting for something really low. So it's easy for the opponent party to accept it. So I think he's probably doing a similar thing to China this time. He's asking for a very high price, and China is not going to pay it. And later on he claims that, well, I'm going to only want like 20–30% of what I've claimed. So this is a business strategy that he has continuously used as a businessman before. So possibly this is something similar this time.
So his art of the deal
exactly.
has been compounded by Peter Navarro's book, Death by China. Now, what do you think of this latest policy measure by the Central Bank of China, which has just adjusted the foreign exchange risk reserve ratio for forward sales from 0 to 20%? Mr. He Weiwen.
I think this is very normal, because it's regarding the forward trading of renminbi and not the prompt delivery trading. So because we are faced with many uncertainties for the next year, we should be fully prepared for any changes, any risks. So that is very correct.
Instead of practical effects, Jiang He, do you think this move is more like a signal sent to the market to convey confidence and determination in stabilizing the RMB?
Well, it's both a signal and an action. So it tells the market we are going to stabilize the RMB, and it's stabilizing the RMB through requiring 20% reserve ratios. So, well, it's both of them. I mean, normally policy have both of the effect. It's telling people our expectations like this, and it's moving the market toward that way. I mean, Chinese government is very famous. Well, I mentioned George Soros' book again. He has been praising China's government's policy for a long period of time in his books and speeches, that China, what he calls the counter-cycle policies. That is, when a risk is appearing, the government is going to set policies to calm the risk. When the fluctuation is coming, the government is going to stop the fluctuation. I mean, on the contrary, United States government has been letting the market do whatever it wants in the past tens of years. So we have saw the 2008 financial crisis.
We need to take a closer look at deliverables, or whether this policy option could make a real difference now to figure out whether this will work. Let's look at the history. The Forex risk reserve ratio was adjusted twice by the central bank in August 2015 and September 2017. However, those adjustments didn't make a big difference in the long-term trend of the RMB. Will the policy measure pay off this time around, given the difference of the context?
I think this is a risk reserve, not an factor affecting the exchange rate of renminbi promptly. The exchange rate of renminbi depends on the three fundamentals: the economic fundamentals of China as a whole, and the international balance of payments internationally, and China's global trade and investment. The three different fundamentals. So far, they are still sound. So we believe the renminbi exchange rate still has a sound foundation.
I think Well, most in China, Chinese observers say in their estimation, the most important fundamental shaping the future of the Chinese economic performance will be the economic performance itself domestically. So we used to have three drivers or three driving forces, right? Domestic consumption, investment, and trade.
Yeah.
Today, as Weiwen said earlier, you need to place hopes on domestic consumption. In fact, it is a policy orientation deliberately. So what do you think of additional driving forces that may hopefully sustain our economic growth in the foreseeable future?
Well, it's definitely coming from the consumption, as you mentioned. Apparently, China consumption is really growing very fast. And you have to know one thing is that China is at a very low economic level compared with developed countries. Apparently, our per capita GDP is about 1/7 of the United States. If you look at 1989, Japan, before the bubble collapsed, Japan's per capita GDP was 90% of the United States at that time. So that means China is entirely different. We have a huge potential at this level. So when you talk about where is the future, the consumption is definitely something. The other thing, export is not killed. I mean, United States counts only about 14% of China's total export and import. It's not everything. It's only 14%.
So only 0.5% of GDP will be removed from this year's expectation. Do you think this is close to the truth?
Well, it depends on how much this export and import from the United States is connected with all the industries. But anyway, it's not going to be a huge problem. I mean, even if China suffer like 1 or 2 percentage points drop of GDP growth rate, that still means we have 4 or 5%. That's even better than Malaysia. So that's fair enough. And the most important thing is that China still only has a per capita GDP of $8,000 to $9,000. So we are going to have a long way to go.
And what about the impact of a fast-growing middle class, a formidable army of consumers?
Yes.
Do you think this formidable force can hardly be ignored or underestimated when we look at the presence of American business community in the mainland market?
Yes, China certainly has the largest middle-class population in the world, and the population of middle class will keep expanding in the next 5 to 10 years. That is the mainstay for the growth of consumption in China. And another thing I want to add is the important thing is the government has important obligation to provide the public goods, to support the public services, and to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor, and to encourage the income growth by the average people so as to create a larger base for consumption.
What do you think of the importance of public service and public goods to be provided by the Chinese authorities at different levels, the central and local alike? Will that help create more margin for domestic consumption?
Well, China has been a government-leading economy for a long period of time. The consumption is rising at this moment. But if you look at the economic theory, the Western economic theory has always been saying that you should let the market do whatever it wants. And it created an economy like Malaysia, Indonesia, India. Their GDP growth was much lower than what China has got. So what China has been doing is that China has been keep on using all the government's efforts to provide a lot of infrastructure and stuff like that. It's a government-leading economy for a long period of time. But now we're transferring to a consumption-driven economy because we have got 40 years since the economic revolution, that economic reform, that we built enough infrastructure by the government. So that's why we had so fast growing.
Enough has been said about the advantages of having the far-flung network of infrastructure, high-speed railway, so on and so forth. But what about the more public services to provide equal and free access to education, health care, so that disposable income of individual consumers could be enhanced effectively for the promotion of domestic consumption? I mean, this might be what Weiwen actually aims at.
I have been, well, as you mentioned about healthcare, actually Chinese government has been doing pretty good when you talk about a country with only 1/7 of per capita GDP compared with the United States. So China is doing good enough over here. I recently just looked at the data about how much women died in the pregnancy when giving childbirth. This is a good indicator about the access to a healthcare system, how your healthcare system is working. China has 22 women dying out of 100,000 medical cases. 22 is the lowest number among BRICS countries. South Africa have about 200. So if you look at the data, United States has 14. But if you look at Shanghai, Shanghai has got 6. So that's only half level of United States. So Chinese government has doing pretty well if you think about the GDP level. It's not good enough, we're improving, but well, it's fine here.
Jiang is probably alluding to the haunting specter that so many middle-class members are complaining about unfair treatment, poor care for the taxpayers, and they have built up too high expectations to such a degree where most of them have been left disappointed. He is defending the strength of in the emerging market as one member of the BRICS bloc. What do you think of his response?
I think, of course, the middle class plays the crucial role in expanding of the consumption and also the expanding of the economy. As far as China is concerned, I don't think that the standard for middle class is all the same in different countries.
You mean definition of the middle
definition
class
varies from
one
country to
the other?
Yes, because the threshold of middle class in China certainly is lower than that of in the United States or in Europe. So we have to measure the problems just according to the domestic situation of each country. Nonetheless, with the expanding on middle class in China, the consumption will grow for sure. One important thing I think the government should pay enough attention to is the growth rate of disposable personal income in China has been slowing down. In some of the provinces, it's slower than growth of GDP. That's a bad thing. And the growth of those people, the minimum average wages and the retired pensions has been growing very slowly for the past 2 years. That's something the government should pay attention to.
What about the local debts? I mean, we have several traps here, local debts and the middle income trap, so on and so forth. But which among these would come across as the most devastating challenge for the sustainability of the Chinese economy?
Well, the local debt, we have been criticizing local debt for a long time, but the good thing is that we have been criticizing it for a long time. We know local debt is a problem. We have been knowing this as a problem for like past 5-7 years. The government has been keep on preparing for that. I mean, if you look at what has happened in 2008, there is a good film called The Big Short, produced by American people. What United States was not paying enough attention to what Warren Buffett called the mass destruction weapon of finance before 2008. So people were not paying attention to that. But China has been paying a lot of attention to the debt problem and property problem. So that's a good thing.
Thank you very much. Finally, we are able to be connected with our overseas guest speaker, Richard Wolff, a Marxian economist and professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts. Hello, Richard. We've been discussing sharp decline of China's trade surplus. Now, what do you think of the driving force behind this decline?
Well, I think that the United States is in a very difficult position and trying to solve a number of different problems by trying new tactics and new strategies. It is not clear at all how long this will last because most of these strategies are not working. Let me explain. The biggest single problem for the United States now is that it is no longer the dominant economic power that it once was. It feels this in every aspect of its life, political, cultural, economic. It is more and more forced to interact with the world. It does not control in the way that it believed itself to be doing after World War II. And the tariffs on China, like the attempted tariffs on Europe, like the turning against immigrants, like the destruction of much of the welfare state that still existed in the United States, all of these are different ways of striking out to try to cope with a decline that is fearful for them because it seems to keep going. It has gone on. It has resisted the efforts of previous administrations to prevent it. And so I think it's important for people in China and elsewhere to understand that what is driving all of this is not the specifics of Chinese trade policy or currency usages or technology transfer. These things are thought up by the advisors for public relations. The underlying problem is a kind of desperate search for some way to recover a sense of lost social position in the world, and that's what's driving the election of Mr. Trump in the first place, and is driving his collection around him of people who are willing to do more desperate things to hold on to the American position than previous administrations were. And this is in tune with the mass of the American people in a peculiar way. And one more thing to say about that.
Now, Richard,
Yeah.
what do you think of the RMB depreciation? Now, Donald Trump, well, the other issue is Donald Trump, your president, declares victory already in the so-called trade war. Is that a political signal to win the midterm congressional elections?
Absolutely. Mr. Trump declares victory always. He declares victory on every single thing he does. That is, he claims to be the victim of everybody else and the winner in a fight with everybody else. He's been doing that all his adult life. He's now going to do that with China simply because that's his way of trying to hold on to the 35 or 40% of the population that shares his sense of a declining America, because for them it's actually true because of what's happened to wages and so on. And so they feel a kinship with him every time he says that America is in some sense being abused, because they feel abused, and he is their champion winning the battles against foreigners, whether those are immigrants coming in or the Chinese government, etc. Everything the Chinese government does, and that's true for other governments too, it's not particularly about China, but everything the Chinese government does will be portrayed as an unfair advantage taken of the United States, to which Mr. Trump will then respond, and when he responds with whatever he says or does, he will win. This is a story that is repeated over and over again.
Well, whether that means some of the people in the United States will get tired of his campaign techniques, it depends on what's going to happen next between the two largest economies. I thank you so much, Richard, for being part of this dialogue, part of this conclusion. See you next time. Goodbye.